On this program, we talk quite a bit about how the president and his family are profiting from his time in the White House. In fact, congressional Democrats think they are so bad that they sued the president, claiming that he's violating the Constitution by owning businesses that are benefiting from foreign governments. Unfortunately for those congressmen, a federal appeals court just ruled here that there is no case. They've tossed their emoluments case. Donald Trump's business practices certainly have been questionable for years, and he's been involved in litigation consistently for decades now. His son-in-law's family, the Kushners, they've also had their share of issues. Well, a new book called American Oligarchs digs deeply into both families, and it is not a pretty picture. So let's bring in the author of that book, Andrea Bernstein. I got to tell you, I thought I read too much about both of these families, but I learned so much more from your book. And one of the things is I really thought both the Kushners and the Trumps, there might have been a marriage, but there wasn't a lot of connective tissue between the two. But their stories, while different, have a lot of similarities. You know, you listen to the president, you'd swear he came over on the Mayflower with his family, but they're both, products of immigration. The Trumps coming over from Germany in the 1880s, the Kushners barely escaping the Nazis in Belarus during the Holocaust. Given all the anti-immigrant rhetoric, it's interesting given the roots of both these families.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. And their stories are, while they're different, they are both stories of immigrants coming to America and making it. In the case of Jared Kushner's family, his grandparents came over in the Holocaust, and it's quite an extraordinary tale of courage and survival, and also fudging their family relationships so they could immigrate to the United States. Jared Kushner's grandfather, Yessel Berkowitz, posed as his father-in-law's son and changed his name to Joe Kushner because they thought it would be more favorable to immigrate into the United States. Donald Trump's grandfather came over from Germany during the Gilded Age, and this was a time during the U.S. when, even though there was vast income inequality as there is today, you could still change your social class, and that's what Friedrich Trump did. He took a train west, he got into the hospitality business, and he made money by satisfying the appetites of prospectors during the last North American gold rush before coming back to New York and investing in real estate at a time when government was putting vast amounts of money into infrastructure, which would enhance the value of that real estate.
Also, from a today concept to both of the families, the president has made it clear he thinks the social safety net and government taking care of certain populations is an anathema. But in your book, you go through that not just the Trumps, but the Kushners as well. They took advantage of, among other things, federal housing subsidies. There's been corporate welfare that certainly has benefited both families, corporate influence here through donations, etc. It's a little curious on how the government's the enemy when the government certainly benefited them, certainly in the real estate world.
Right. I mean, I think the family stories are slightly different, but they're related. In the case of the Kushner family, Joe Kushner had been a carpenter in Poland, where he's from, started working as a carpenter, building homes in New Jersey after the war. And this was a time when there was a huge need for housing. GIs were coming back, couples were once again starting families after the war, and the government was pouring money into federal mortgage insurance and also into things like the Federal Aid Highway Act, which built the roads that enabled people to get to all the suburban homes that the Kushner family was building. So they certainly benefited initially from this great infusion of money into infrastructure and into mortgage insurance. Fred Trump also, Donald Trump's father, also benefited, although he put his thumbs on the scales more, at least at that early period. He understood that in order to get things from the government, he needed to court government officials. And he really learned this lesson as early as the 1930s and became a very big Democratic Party donor in Brooklyn, because that's who controlled the political machine and ultimately controlled the contracts and even controlled certain people who had federal positions. So Fred Trump, Donald Trump's father, was really putting his thumbs on the scale early on and creating a business model that his son followed and still follows to this day, although now it's flipped that he's in the White House.
You know, in reading your book, I thought back to the moment the Access Hollywood tape blew up. And like most of us, I certainly thought that, and apparently those within the inner circle of then candidate Trump, some openly told me he needed to get out of the race to give a Republican a chance because they thought it was the beginning of the end. But there was a notable voice who told Donald Trump that he was going to get past this, and that was Jared Kushner. It makes a lot more sense when we get into the story of his father, Charles Kushner. For the folks, and there's a lot of people watching us beyond the metropolitan area, we all remember, or at least a lot of us do, that story, how, you know, it was plastered all over the headlines at the time. But remind everybody what Charles Kushner did within even his own family here and how that all played out.
So Charles Kushner, Jared Kushner's father, was someone, he was a very, very flagrant philanthropist in New Jersey and became a very generous Democratic donor. At one point, he was the biggest donor to the Democratic Party in New Jersey. He gave as much to Democrats as George W. Bush got from Enron. So he was an influential person, but he also was crossing limits and running through stop signs. And he began to violate tax laws. He began to do something that you're not allowed to do, which is to make donations in others' names. And his brother, who was connected to him through this network of shell companies and limited liability companies that their father had set up and trusts, sued his brother, sued Charlie Kushner. The U.S. attorney at the time, Chris Christie, who was himself a young Republican prosecutor on the rise, caught wind of this lawsuit, and his office began investigating. And they began to find ways that they believed Charles Kushner had broken the law, both with respect to tax evasion and campaign finance violations. And Charles Kushner became convinced, erroneously, that his brother and sister had cooked the whole thing up. So he hired a sex worker to entrap his sister's husband and sent a videotape of the encounter to his sister just as Chris Christie's investigation was about to be announced. He was arrested. Charles Kushner was arrested and was charged with witness tampering and campaign finance violations and tax violations, and he ultimately pleaded guilty and served a year in prison.
A story that I didn't know as much, and then in your book you go into detail. It isn't just Donald Trump, the president, that has faced some possible real legal channels, but also Donald Jr. and Ivanka specifically with that Trump Soho project. And once again, Cy Vance, the district attorney in New York City, is a central figure in this. Talk about what you learned.
Right. So, I mean, I think one of the things, just to broaden the picture for a moment, that was so extraordinary to me about the Trump family and Donald Trump in particular was his ability to evade law enforcement consequences. And what happened with the Trump Soho was that his children, again, a criminal case started with a civil suit, had been sued for lying to buyers at the Trump Soho Hotel about how many units had been sold. And the DA's office began to investigate, and an email chain emerged in which there was evidence that Donald Trump Jr. and Ivanka Trump knew that they were lying and did so anyway, which is a felony in the state of New York. And there was an investigation. It was not being dropped, and Donald Trump made his own last-minute move. His personal attorney, Mark Kasowitz, paid a visit to the Manhattan DA. Now, Mark Kasowitz had given $25,000 to Cy Vance in the months prior to this meeting, and when they met, the donation was actually returned, but they had a private meeting without the other lawyers who had worked on the case or the prosecutors who worked on the case, and 3 months later, the case was dropped. Not long after that, the DA received an even bigger contribution from Mark Kasowitz than the one that had been returned.
I'm curious, after the reporting you did, there's obviously so many outstanding questions still 3+ years later regarding still Trump University, Trump Organization, Trump Foundation, the Inauguration Fund, Trump's financial returns. Do you believe there's an inevitability that we'll see these documents at some point Or are you less convinced now we're finally going to get the daylight or the transparency so many of us have been waiting for?
Well, hope springs eternal, and there are still some cases before the U.S. Supreme Court that could potentially force Donald Trump to turn over his tax returns and other documents. So it's still undecided, but the fact that the Supreme Court would take the case suggests that they have questions about whether the president should have to turn over his tax returns. I mean, this is in the tradition of the Trump family, that he has managed by having these aggressive, constant legal responses to evade legal consequences. We just saw it in the impeachment trial.
Well, it is a fascinating book here. Again, it's American Oligarchs, the Kushners, the Trumps, and the Marriage of Money and Power. Andrea Bernstein, I appreciate a few minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Great to talk to you.
You as well. All right, everyone, when we come back, we will pivot to the race for the White House. If Joe Biden continues to struggle, will Democrats turn their lonely eyes to Mike Bloomberg, hoping he's the man with the message and the experience that gives them the best shot to beat Trump in November? Andrew and I will discuss after this.